Saint Augustine on the Most Holy Trinity, Book 11, Chapter 4, How this unity comes to pass. But if that will which moves to and fro, hither and thither, the eyes that is to be informed and unites it when formed, shall have wholly converged to the inward fantasy, and shall have absolutely turned the mind's eye from the presence of the bodies which lie around the senses, and from the very bodily senses themselves, and shall have wholly turned it to that image which is perceived within. Then so exact a likeness of the bodily species expressed from the memory is presented, that not even reason itself is permitted to discern whether the body itself is seen without, or only something of the kind thought of within. For men sometimes, either allured or frightened by overmuch thinking of visible things, have even suddenly uttered words accordingly, as if in real fact they were engaged in the very midst of such actions or sufferings. And I remember someone telling me that he was wont to perceive in thought so distinct and as it were solid a form of a female body, as to be moved as though it were a reality. Such power has the soul over its own body, and such influence has it in turning and changing the quality of its corporeal garment, just as a man may be affected when clothed, to whom his clothing sticks. It is the same kind of affection, too, with which we are beguiled through imaginations in sleep. But it makes a very great difference whether the senses of the body are lulled to torpor, as in the case of sleepers, or disturbed from their inward structure, as in the case of madmen, or distracted in some other mode, as in that of diviners or prophets. And so from one or other of these causes, the intention of the mind is forced by a kind of necessity upon those images which occur to it, either from memory or by some other hidden force, through certain spiritual commixtures of a similarly spiritual substance, or whether, as sometimes happens to people in health and awake, that the will occupied by thought turns itself away from the senses, and so informs the eye of the mind by various images of sensible things, as though those sensible things themselves were actually perceived. But these impressions of images not only take place when the will is directed upon such things by desiring them, but also when, in order to avoid and guard against them, the mind is carried away to look upon these very things so as to flee from them. And hence, not only desire, but fear causes both the bodily eye to be informed by the sensible things themselves, and the mental eye by the images of those sensible things. Accordingly, the more vehement has been either fear or desire, the more distinctly is the eye informed, whether in the case of him who sensuously perceives by means of the body that which lies close to him in place, or in case of him who conceives from the image of the body which is contained in the memory. What then a body in place is to the bodily sense, that the similitude of a body in memory is to the eye of the mind, and what the vision of one who looks at a thing is to that appearance of the body from which the sense is informed, that the vision of a concipient is to the image of the body established in the memory, from which the eye of the mind is informed. and what the intention of the will is towards the body seen and the vision to be combined with it, in order that a certain unity of three things may therein take place, although their nature is diverse, that the same intention of the will is towards combining the image of the body, which is in the memory, and the vision of the concipient, that is, the form which the eye of the mind has taken in returning to the memory, in order that hereto a certain unity may take place of three things, not now distinguished by diversity of nature, but of one and the same substance, because this whole is within, and the whole is one mind. Chapter 5. Summary. The Trinity of the outer man or of external vision is not an image of God. The likeness of God is desired even in sins. In external vision, the form of the corporeal thing is, as it were, the parent vision of the offspring. But the will that unites these suggests the Holy Spirit. But as when both the form and species of a body have perished, the will can't recall to it the sense of perceiving. So when the image which memory bears is blotted out by forgetfulness, the will be unable to force back the eye of the mind by recollection, so as to be formed thereby. But because the mind has great power to imagine not only things forgotten, but also things that it never saw or experienced, either by increasing or diminishing, or changing or compounding after its pleasure, those which have not dropped out of its remembrance, it often imagines things to be such as either it knows they are not, or does not know that they are. And in this case we have to take care, lest it either speak falsely that it may deceive, or hold an opinion so as to be deceived. And if it avoid these two evils, then imagined phantasms do not hinder it, just as sensible things experienced or retained by memory do not hinder it, if they are neither passionately sought for when pleasant, nor basely shunned when unpleasant. But when the will leaves better things and greedily wallows in these, then it becomes unclean, and they are so thought of hurtfully when they are present, and also more hurtfully when they are absent. And he therefore lives badly and degenerately who lives according to the Trinity of the outer man, because it is the purpose of using things sensible and corporeal that has begotten also that Trinity, which although it imagines within, yet imagines things without. For no one could use those things even well, unless the images of things perceived by the senses were retained in the memory. And unless the will for the greatest part dwells in the higher and interior things, and unless that will itself, which is accommodated either to bodies without or to the images of them within, refers whatever it receives in them to a better and truer life, and rests in that end, by gazing at which it judges that those things ought to be done. What else do we do but that which the Apostle prohibits us from doing when he says, "Be not conformed to this world." Romans 12:2. And therefore, that Trinity is not an image of God, since it is produced in the mind itself through the bodily sense, from the lowest, that is, the corporeal creature, than which the mind is higher. Yet neither is it altogether dissimilar. For what is there that has not a likeness of God in proportion to its kind and measure, seeing that God made all things very good. Genesis 3:5. Ecclesiasticus 39:16. And for no other reason except that he himself is supremely good, in so far, therefore, as anything that is good, in so far plainly it has still some likeness of the supreme good, at however great a distance. And if a natural likeness, then certainly a right and well-ordered one. But if a faulty likeness, then certainly a debased and perverse one. For even souls in their very sins strive after nothing else but some kind of likeness of God, in a proud and preposterous, and so to say, slavish liberty. So neither could our first parents have been persuaded to sin unless it had been said, "Ye shall be as gods." Genesis 3:5. No doubt, everything in the creatures which is in any way like a god is not also to be called his image, but that alone than which he himself alone is higher, for that only is in all points copied from him, between which and himself no nature is interposed. Of that vision, then, that is of the form which is wrought in the sense of him who sees, the form of the bodily thing from which it is wrought, as it were the parent. But it is not a true parent, whence neither is that a true offspring, for it is not altogether born therefrom, since something else is applied to the bodily thing in order that it may be formed from it, namely, the sense of him who sees. And for this reason, to love this is to be estranged. Therefore the will which unites both, viz., the quasi-parent and the quasi-child, is more spiritual than either of them, for that bodily thing which is discerned is not spiritual at all, but the vision which comes into existence in the sense has something spiritual mingled with it, since it can't come into existence without the soul. But it is not wholly spiritual, since that which is formed is a sense of the body. Therefore, the will which unites both is confessedly more spiritual, as I have said, and so it begins to suggest, as it were, the person of the Spirit in the Trinity. But it belongs more to the sense that is formed than to the bodily thing whence it is formed. For the sense and will of an animate being belongs to the soul, not to the stone or other bodily thing that is seen. It does not therefore proceed from that bodily thing as from a parent, yet neither does it proceed from that other, as it were, offspring, namely, the vision and form that is in the sense. For the will existed before the vision came to pass, which will applied the sense that was to be formed to the bodily thing that was to be discerned. But it was not yet satisfied. For how could that which was not yet seen satisfy? And satisfaction means a will that rests content. And therefore we can neither call the will the quasi-offspring of vision, since it existed before vision, nor the quasi-parent, since that vision was not formed and expressed from the will, but from the bodily thing that was seen. Chapter 5. Of what kind we are to reckon the rest, requies, and end, finis, of the will in vision. Perhaps we can rightly call vision the end and rest of the will only with respect to this one object, namely the bodily thing that is visible. For it will not will nothing else merely because it sees something which it is now willing. It is not therefore the whole will itself of the man of which the end is nothing else than blessedness, but the will provisionally directed to this one object, which has as its end in seeing nothing but vision, whether it refer the thing seen to any other thing or not. For if it does not refer the vision to anything further, but wills only to see this, there can be no question made about showing that the end of the will is the vision, for it is manifest. But if it does refer it to anything further, then certainly it does will something else, and it will not be now a will merely to see, or if to see, not one to see the particular thing, just as, if anyone wished to see the scar, that from thence he might learn that there had been a wound, or wished to see the window, that through the window he might see the passers-by. All these and other such acts of will have their own proper proximate ends, which are referred to that final end of the will by which we will to live blessedly and to attain to that life which is not referred to anything else that suffices of itself to him who loves it. The will then to see has as its end vision, and the will to see this particular thing has as its end the vision of this particular thing. Therefore the will to see the scars desires its own end, that is, the vision of the scar, and does not reach beyond it. For the will to prove that there had been a wound is a distinct will, although dependent upon that of which the end also is to prove that there had been a wound. And the will to see the window has as its end the vision of the window, for that is another and further will which depends upon it, viz., to see the passers-by through the window, of which also the end is the vision of the passers-by. But all the several wills that are bound to each other are at once right, if that one is good, to which all are referred, and if that is bad, then all are bad. And so the connected series of right wills is a sort of road which consists, as it were, of certain steps, whereby to ascend to blessedness, but the entanglement of depraved and distorted wills is a bound by which he will be bound who thus acts, so as to be cast into outer darkness. Matthew chapter 22, verse 13. Blessed therefore are they who in act and character sing the song of the steps. Psalm 120 and following. And woe to those that draw sin as it were a long rope. Isaiah 5:18. And it is just the same to speak of the will being in repose, which we call its end, if it is still referred to something further, as if we should say that the foot is at rest in walking, when it is placed there, whence yet another foot may be planted in the direction of the man's steps. But if something so satisfies that the will acquiesces in it with a certain delight, it is nevertheless not yet that to which the man ultimately tends, but this too is referred to something further, so as to be regarded not as the native country of a citizen, but as a place of refreshment, or even of stopping for a traveler. Chapter 7. There is another Trinity in the memory of him who thinks over again what he has seen. But yet again, take the case of another Trinity, more inward indeed than that which is in things sensible and in the senses, but which is yet conceived from thence, while now it is no longer the sense of the body that is informed from the body, but the eye of the mind that is informed from the memory, since the species of the body which we perceived from without has inhered in the memory itself. And that species which is in the memory we call the quasi-parent of that which is wrought in the fantasy of one who conceives. For it was in the memory also before we conceived it, just as the body was in place also before we sensuously perceived it, in order that vision might take place. But when it is conceived, then from that form which the memory retains, there is copied in the mind's eye of him who conceives, and by remembrance is formed that species which is the quasi-offspring of that which the memory retains. But neither is the one a true parent, nor the other a true offspring. For the mind's vision, which is formed from memory when we think anything by recollection, does not proceed from that species which we remember as seen, since we could not indeed have remembered those things unless we had seen them. Yet the mind's eye, which is informed by the recollection, existed also before we saw the body that we remember, and therefore how much more before we committed it to memory. Although therefore the form which is wrought in the mind's eye of him who remembers is wrought from that form which is in the memory, yet the mind's eye itself does not exist from thence, but existed before it. And it follows that if the one is not a true parent, neither is the other a true offspring, but both that quasi-parent and that quasi-offspring suggest something whence the inner and truer things may appear more practically and more certainly. Further, it is more difficult to discern clearly whether the will which connects the vision to the memory is not either the parent or the offspring of some one of them, and the likeness and equality of the same nature and substance cause this difficulty of distinguishing. For it is not possible to do in this case as with the sense that is formed from without, which is easily discerned from the sensible body, and again the will from both, on account of the difference of nature, which is mutually in all three, and of which we have treated sufficiently above. For although this Trinity, of which we at present speak, is introduced into the mind from without, yet it is transacted within, and there is no part of it outside of the nature of the mind itself. In what way, then, can it be demonstrated that the will is neither the quasi-parent nor the quasi-offspring, either of the corporeal likeness which is contained in the memory, or of that which is copied thence in recollecting, when it so unites both in the act of conceiving, as that they appear singly as one and can be discerned except by reason? It is then first to be considered that there can't be any will to remember, unless we retain in the recesses of the memory either the whole or some part of that thing which we wish to remember. For the very will to remember can't arise in the case of a thing which we have forgotten altogether and absolutely, since we have already remembered that the thing which we wish to remember is or has been in our memory. For example, if I wish to remember what I supped on yesterday, either I have already remembered that I did sup, or if not yet this, at least I have remembered something about that time itself, if nothing else. At all events, I have remembered yesterday and that part of yesterday in which people usually sup, and what supping is. For if I had not remembered anything at all of this kind, I could not wish to remember that I supped on yesterday. Whence we may perceive that the will of remembering proceeds indeed from those things which are retained in the memory, with the addition also of those which, by the act of discerning, are copied thence, through recollection. That is, from the combination of something which we have remembered, and of the vision which was thence wrought when we remembered in the mind's eye of him who thinks. But the will itself, which unites both, requires also some other thing, which is, as it were, close at hand and adjacent to him who remembers. There are then as many trinities of this kind as there are remembrances, because there is no one of them wherein there are not these three things, viz., that which was stored up in the memory also before it was thought, and that which takes place in the conception when this is discerned, and the will that unites both, and from both and itself as a third completes one single thing. Or is it rather that we so recognize some one Trinity in this kind as that we are to speak generally of whatever corporeal species lie hidden in the memory, as of a single unity, and again of the general vision of the mind which remembers and conceives such things as of a single unity, to the combination of which two there is to be joined as a third the will that combines them, that this whole may be a certain unity made up from three